She was insulted right at the grand hall entrance, kneeling to scrub a stain on the marble floor. A glamorous guest kicked her foot past Layla's shoulder and sneered. "Clean faster." A maid blocking millionaire traffic. Layla simply bowed her head, silent as always. But when the tall sheikh stepped onto the podium and began speaking in ancient Arabic that no one understood, it was she, the woman cast into the shadows, who lifted her chin and replied in a voice so pure it seemed to echo from a lost century. The room fell dead silent, and the sheikh froze, eyes unblinking. Only someone of Zara's blood would know that tongue. Layla's hands stilled on the rag, the bleach stinging her knuckles. The gala was in full swing now, chandeliers glittering above the clink of champagne glasses sharp in the air. Men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns flowed through the grand hall of Sheikh Rami's London estate, their voices loud with money and ambition. She'd been told to stay out of sight to keep the floor spotless, while the world's elite made deals that could shift economies. Her white uniform shirt, wrinkled from hours of work, clung to her back. Her long black skirt dragged slightly as she shifted to the side, trying to disappear into the corner. But that one guest, a woman with diamond earrings that caught the light like tiny knives, hadn't let her fade away. Her words still hung there, sharp and deliberate, meant to cut. Layla didn't look up. She just kept scrubbing her movements steady, her face calm. A young heiress barely out of her teens paused near Layla, her heels clicking loudly on the marble. She tilted her head of her glossy ponytail swinging and smirked at her friend. Look at her hands. You would think she'd at least wear gloves to hide those calluses. Her friend, clutching a designer clutch, stifled a laugh and whispered back, "Probably can't afford them." The heiress bent slightly as if inspecting Layla's work and flicked a piece of lint from her dress onto the floor Layla had just cleaned. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with fake innocence. Layla's fingers paused on the rag just for a moment before she reached out and wiped the lint away her movements, deliberate, her eyes never meeting theirs. The heiress laughed louder this time and walked off her heels, echoing like gunfire. But the sting of it lingered. Not just the words, but the way the woman's friends had laughed, their eyes sliding over Layla like she was part of the furniture. Another guest, a man with a slicked-back ponytail and a watch that probably cost more than her yearly wage, stepped over her bucket without a glance. "Careful," he muttered to his companion. "Don't trip over the help." The companion, a younger woman with a tight smile, giggled and adjusted her purse, like Layla's presence was some kind of inconvenience they'd all laugh about later. Layla's jaw tightened, but she didn't say a word. She just moved her bucket an inch to the left and kept working. The assistant, a wiry man with a clipboard and a permanent frown, appeared out of nowhere. He leaned down, his voice low but biting. "Move. Are you cleaning or trying to get on the headlines?" His eyes darted to the arriving guests, as if her kneeling there was a personal embarrassment. Layla nodded, grabbed her bucket, and stood, her apron catching on her skirt as she moved toward the service door. The assistant didn't wait for her to respond. He was already waving over a waiter with a tray of drinks, his attention back to the important people. Layla slipped behind the door, but not before another guest, a woman in a red gown with lips painted to match, sneered, "What a posh atmosphere ruined by the smell of bleach." The laughter that followed felt like a slap. In the service hallway, a waiter bumped into Layla, nearly spilling his tray of canapes. He caught himself, then glared at her like it was her fault. "Watch where you're standing," he hissed, brushing past. "You're not even supposed to be out here during the event." Layla stepped back, her shoulder brushing the cold wall, and adjusted her grip on the bucket. Her face stayed calm, but her fingers pressed harder into the handle, the plastic creaking slightly. The waiter didn't notice. He was already halfway down the hall, muttering about how the staff was ruining the evening. Layla's eyes followed him for a moment, then dropped to the floor where a single canapé had fallen. She knelt, picked it up, and tucked it into a napkin, her movements precise, like she was handling something fragile. Layla stood in the dim hallway, her back against the wall, the bucket heavy in her hand. The noise of the gala muffled through the door, but she could still hear the hum of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. She closed her eyes for a second. Just one, letting the weight of it settle. She wasn't new to this. She'd been dismissed before, judged by her clothes, her quietness, the way she didn't fight back. But it didn't make it easier. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the bucket, and she took a slow breath. She wasn't here to make a scene. She was here to work, to survive, to keep her head down and move forward like she always had. Hey, if this story's hitting you, take a second to open your phone, like this video, drop a comment below, and hit that subscribe button. It means the world to keep sharing these stories with you, and I'd love to know what you're feeling right now. All right, let's keep going. The butler, a tall man with a face like he'd been carved from stone, caught her in the hallway. He grabbed her arm not hard, but firm enough to make his point. "Get in the kitchen," he said, his voice low like he was trying not to draw attention. "No maids in sight during receptions." "You know, that..." Layla nodded, pulling her arm free gently, her face still composed. She didn't argue. She never did. She walked toward the kitchen, her steps quiet, her head slightly bowed. But as she passed the service door, she heard it, the sheikh's voice deep and steady filling the grand hall. He was speaking in old Hadrami Arabic, a dialect so rare it was like hearing a ghost. The words rolled out heavy with history, carrying the weight of centuries. The room beyond the door went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people listening, but the awkward quiet of confusion. The translator, a nervous man with glasses slipping down his nose, stammered his notes useless. The sheikh paused, his glass raised his eyes, scanning the crowd. "No one here understands the language of my ancestors." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing them. Layla stopped her hand on the kitchen door. She shouldn't have listened. She should have kept walking. But something in his voice pulled at her like a thread she couldn't ignore. She stepped back to the service door, just out of sight, and listened. The sheikh's words were precise, deliberate, quoting an oath from 1742, a promise made by Grand Patriarch Rami I to protect the land and its people. She knew it. Not from books or classes, but from her great-grandmother's voice, soft and steady, reciting it to her as a child in the quiet rooms of Al-Karim Palace. Layla's lips moved silently, matching his words. Then without thinking, she spoke. "You're referencing the oath of Grand Patriarch Rami I in the year 1742. Her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. The room turned. Heads swiveled, eyes searching for the source. Layla stood just behind the door, her hands still damp from the rag. The sheikh's gaze found her, his eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with something else, recognition maybe, or curiosity. Only someone of blood would know that he said, his voice carrying across the hall. The guests shifted their murmurs, starting low like a hum of bees. Layla didn't move. She didn't shrink back. She just stood there, her chin lifted slightly, her eyes steady on his. A Japanese businessman in a sharp suit leaned toward his colleague, his voice loud enough to carry. She probably memorized some history lines to play scholar. His tone was dismissive, like she was a child reciting a poem for attention. An American guest, his tie loosened, and a glass of whiskey in his hand, shook his head. "I lived in Qatar for 3 years, and don't even know what dialect that was." The translator, still flustered, pushed his glasses up and snapped. "She's wrong. Hadrami doesn't use the Kaf consonant the way she just did." A noblewoman in a glittering green dress laughed, her voice sharp. Maybe she learned it from some historical soap opera. Layla didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on the sheikh, calm and unyielding. But the words stung, each one a little pinprick, building on the ones before. She could feel the room turning against her, their judgment settling like dust. She bowed her head slightly, not in defeat, but in control, letting their words pass over her. The sheikh tilted his head, studying her. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, directed at her. "Where did you learn that pronunciation?" A woman in a pearl necklace, her fingers glittering with rings, leaned forward from her seat near the podium. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. "She's just trying to impress." Probably overheard some old recording in the servants' quarters. Her companion, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, nodded, smirking. "Exactly. Next, she'll claim she's the sheikh's long-lost cousin." The room tittered, the laughter spreading like a ripple. Layla's hand twitched, but she kept it still, her fingers brushing the edge of her apron. She didn't look at the woman or the man. Her gaze stayed on the sheikh, steady, as if their words were just background noise. Layla's hand tightened around the rag she still held. She took a small step forward, just enough to be seen clearly. "I didn't learn it," she said, her voice steady, like she was stating a fact. "I grew up inside Al-Karim Palace, trained by my great-grandmother, the first wife of Rami bin Mahfouz." The words hung there, simple and true. The room went still again, but this time it was different. The murmurs stopped. The businessman's glass froze halfway to his lips. The noblewoman's smile faltered. An aide, a young man with a tablet and a nervous energy, tapped furiously at his screen. His face paled as he read something, then leaned toward the sheikh, whispering, "That region was the ancestral capital of your bloodline. No outsiders know that ceremonial reading. Layla reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a faded red silk scarf, its edges worn, but the double moon insignia unmistakable. The Zara family crest. She held it lightly, not displaying it, just letting it be seen. The Sheikh's eyes locked on it and his voice softened. "What is your name?" In the crowd, a young diplomat, his suit pristine and his accent polished, raised his voice. "This is absurd," he said, turning to the guests around him. "A maid with a scarf. She could have stitched that herself." He gestured toward Layla, his hand slicing through the air. "She's playing us all, and we're falling for it." A few guests nodded, their faces hardening. One woman clutched her purse tighter, as if Layla might steal it. Layla's lips pressed together, but she didn't speak. She folded the scarf carefully, her fingers tracing the double moon insignia, and tucked it back into her pocket. Her silence was louder than any defense. "Layla," she said simply. "Layla bint Zara al-Karim." The name landed like a stone in still water ripples spreading through the room. The investor from earlier, the one with the slick ponytail, scoffed loudly. "I've got a Chanel scarf. Does that make me royalty too?" The noblewoman laughed again, but it was thinner now, less certain. "Probably picked it up at a thrift store," she said, her eyes darting to the sheikh, checking for his reaction. The board chair, a heavy man with a red face, snapped at the butler. "Throw her out. She's embarrassing the guests." The butler stepped forward, his hand reaching for Layla's wrist. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but her eyes flicked to his and he hesitated. Before he could touch her, the sheikh raised his hand, his voice cutting through the tension. "No one touches a bearer of Zara's blood." The butler froze, his hand dropping. The room was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of confusion or mockery now. It was the silence of something shifting, something bigger than any of them had expected. A guest near the back, a woman with a sharp bob and a designer scarf of her own, whispered loudly to her friend. "She's probably been planning this for months, sneaking into the gala waiting for her moment." Her friend nodded, eyes narrowed. "Look at her standing there like she owns the place. It's pathetic." Layla's shoulders stiffened just slightly, but she didn't turn. Instead, she adjusted her apron, smoothing it with a slow, deliberate motion, as if reminding herself of her place or rejecting it. The sheikh's eyes didn't leave her, his expression unreadable but steady. The sheikh's legal advisor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned in, his voice low but urgent. "The old succession terms of Rami bin Mahfouz are still valid. If she's real, the assets must be redivided." He glanced at Layla, then back at the sheikh. "There's a blocked Swiss bank account. It requires a biometric passcode from Zara's maternal line." Layla's hand moved to her apron again, this time pulling out an ancient gold coin, its surface worn, but the double moon seal clear. She held it out not to the advisor, but to the sheikh. The room seemed to hold its breath. As the advisor took the coin, a venture capitalist in a sleek gray suit stepped forward, his voice dripping with skepticism. "A coin? Really? You can buy those at any antique shop in Dubai." He turned to the crowd, raising his hands for support. "This is a performance, nothing more." A few guests murmured in agreement, their confidence returning. Layla's eyes flicked to the coin in the advisor's hand, then back to the sheikh. She didn't counter the man's words. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, as if daring him to look closer. The advisor's fingers trembled as he examined the coin, his voice barely audible. This is authentic." The advisor's eyes widened. He took the coin, turning it over in his hands, then looked at the sheikh. "This matches the seal stored in Zurich," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The implications hit the room like a wave. Every deal they'd been negotiating, every contract on the table, could be upended if Layla activated that passcode. $420 million locked away for decades, suddenly within reach. The sheikh nodded, his expression unreadable. "She doesn't need a throne," he said, "but I must honor blood." The investor from Dubai, a man with a booming voice and a gold chain around his neck, couldn't hold back. "This is a coup," he shouted, pointing at Layla. "She's trying to unseat the sheikh." A woman in a silver dress, her face tight with panic, cried out, "If she claims anything, we pull all our capital." The room erupted in murmurs, accusations, fear. Layla stood still, her hands folded in front of her, the scarf and coin now tucked back into her apron. She didn't look at the investor or the woman. She didn't need to. A reporter in the corner, her notepad already filled with scribbles, pushed through the crowd, her camera flashing. "Who are you really?" she demanded, her voice sharp with excitement. "Are you here to claim the fortune?" Layla's eyes met hers, calm and unyielding. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket, not for the scarf or the coin, but for a small worn photograph. She held it briefly, just long enough for the reporter to catch a glimpse of a young girl standing beside an elderly woman in a palace courtyard. Then she tucked it away, her face unchanged. The reporter's pen stopped moving, her question unanswered, but her curiosity burning. Someone in the crowd snapped a photo, the flash bright in the dim hall. Within minutes, it was online, the headlines spreading like wildfire. The maid who inherited a $400 million estate. Layla's eyes flicked to the sheikh, and she spoke, her voice calm but clear. "I'm not claiming anything," she said. "Just restoring my name, and I will quietly leave if His Grace allows." The sheikh looked at her, and for the first time, his face softened, not with pity, but with something like respect. As Layla turned to step back toward the service door, a woman in a velvet gown grabbed her arm, her nails digging in. "You think you can just walk in here and rewrite history?" She hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You're nobody. You'll always be nobody." Layla didn't pull away. She looked at the woman's hand, then up at her face, her eyes steady. The woman faltered, her grip loosening, and Layla gently freed her arm, her movements slow, almost graceful. The woman stepped back, her face flushed as if she'd been the one exposed. Layla didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The gala continued, but the air had changed. The guests whispered, their eyes darting to Layla as she moved back to the service door. The businessman who'd mocked her earlier spilled his drink, his hands shaking. The noblewoman's laughter was gone, her face pale as she checked her phone, seeing the news spread. The butler who'd grabbed her arm stood frozen, his eyes on the floor. Layla didn't look back. She slipped into the kitchen, and her steps as quiet as ever, but her presence lingered in the hall like a shadow. In the kitchen, a cook glanced at Layla, then quickly looked away, pretending to focus on a tray of pastries. "Heard what happened out there?" she muttered, her voice low. "Don't know how you didn't slap someone." Layla set her bucket down, her movements slow, and began rinsing her rag under the sink. The water ran clear, then cloudy, as the bleach dripped away. She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if the cook's words were a small acknowledgement, a crack in the wall of judgment. The cook shook her head, almost smiling, and went back to her work. Layla wrung out the rag, her hands steady, and hung it to dry. Days later, the consequences began to unfold. The Japanese businessman's firm pulled out of a major deal when the sheikh's team questioned his integrity. The noblewoman's social media was flooded with comments calling out her cruelty. Her sponsorships quietly dropped. The board chair, who demanded Layla be thrown out, was asked to step down from his position, his name tied to the scandal. None of it was loud or dramatic. It was just the truth catching up, like it always does. Layla didn't see it happen. She was already gone, her apron left folded on the kitchen counter. The sheikh didn't let it end there. At a press conference a week later, he stood before a crowd of reporters, his voice steady. "I never knew I had such a daughter," he said, and the words carried a weight that silenced the room. He announced that Layla would lead the Zara Foundation, a trust dedicated to women's education, one her great-grandmother had helped establish decades ago. Layla didn't return to the estate. She didn't want it. Instead, she moved to Marrakesh, where the foundation's work was, centered her office, a small room with a view of the mountains. In Marrakesh, Layla walked through a local market one morning, her hair loose under a simple scarf. A vendor, an older woman with weathered hands, recognized her from a news article and pressed a small pomegranate into her hand. "For strength," the woman said, her eyes warm. Layla accepted it, her fingers closing around the fruit, and nodded. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, a quiet acknowledgement of the gesture. The vendor watched her go, whispering to her neighbor about the maid who'd become a leader. Layla kept walking, the pomegranate heavy in her pocket, a small reminder of the world beyond the gala's cruelty. The investors who'd screamed about coups and capital came back, some with apologies, others with offers of support. The media couldn't stop talking about her, the headlines painting her as a legend, the silent bloodline, the heiress who rose from the mop bucket. But Layla didn't read them. She didn't need to. She sat at her desk in Marrakesh, the red silk scarf folded beside her, and worked. Her hands, once raw from bleach, now held a pen, signing papers that would send girls to school, build libraries, change lives. One evening, a young girl from the foundation's program visited Layla's office, clutching a notebook. "I want to be like you," she said, her voice trembling with awe. Layla looked up from her papers, her pen pausing. She pushed the scarf aside and leaned forward, her eyes meeting the girl's. "Be like you," she said, softly tapping the notebook. The girl's face lit up and she nodded, clutching the notebook tighter. Layla watched her leave, then turned back to her work, the mountains outside glowing in the fading light. The sheikh visited her once unannounced. He stood in her office, his presence filling the small space. He didn't say much, just looked at her, then at the scarf. "You carry her strength," he said, his voice quiet. Layla nodded, her eyes steady. She didn't need his approval, but she accepted his respect. When he left, she turned back to her work, the mountains outside her window glowing in the evening light. She'd been mocked, dismissed, humiliated, but she'd never bent. She'd stood in that grand hall, her voice steady, her truth undeniable. And now, in the quiet of her new life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not on a throne, not in a mansion, but in a place where her name meant something, where her work mattered, where her silence spoke louder than any shout. The world had judged her, but she had never needed their judgment. She had carried her truth all along in a faded scarf and a gold coin, in the language of her ancestors. And when the room had turned, when the sheikh had seen her, when the truth had come to light, she hadn't gloated. She had just walked forward. This is for everyone who's been looked down on, who's been told they don't belong. You know that feeling, don't you? The sting of it, the weight. But you're still here. You're still standing. You're not wrong. You're not alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.